This week we're looking at Chapter 2 of Kant's Groundwork for a Metaphysic of Morals, and we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at 4 illustrations that Kant provides for us of how the categorical imperative works. Now what he does is he formulates the categorical imperative in different ways. The first way that he does it is called the natural law formulation, the natural law formulation of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative in its more generic formulation is just the formal maxim that we talked about last week as imperative. Because you and I are imperfectly rational beings, we encounter the formal maxim as a command. And that command says, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. But early in Chapter 2, Kant reformulates that into what I'm calling the natural law formulation. The natural law formulation says, act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. And so this is just another way of thinking about the categorical imperative, to think of it as demanding that we act as if our maxims were to become natural laws, like gravity or something like that. Every time you act, imagine what would happen if your maxim were to become a natural law like gravity. Kant gives 4 illustrations of how to apply this natural law formulation. What's interesting is that after the 4 illustrations, he formulates the categorical imperative again into what we call the end in itself formulation. And then he gives us the same 4 illustrations and shows us how to apply that formulation as well. So the hard part about this section, and my lecture today, is just to help you understand what's going on in those 4 illustrations. He's applying 2 tests. As he looks at these 4 illustrations, he has 2 tests that he's applying. Now notice that the illustrations occur between pages 89 and 91, but he doesn't explain the tests until page 91, until after. And so the first time you read, it's hard to figure out what's going on. So let's talk about the 2 tests first, and then you can go back and read the 4 illustrations. There are 2 tests because Kant says there are basically 2 different kinds of duties. And the 2 tests reveal these different duties. 2 different kinds of duties: rigorous duties and meritorious duties. In more modern speak, we call these strong duties and weak duties. Let's talk about these 2 tests for consistency that Kant is applying to his 4 illustrations. Test 1, consistency in conception. In order for a maxim to serve as a universal law, we must be able to conceive of ourselves living by the maxim while everyone else is living by a law of nature based on the maxim. So in other words, every time you're going to act, you formulate your maxim, and what you're trying to discover is whether you could live by the maxim if it were at the same time a law of nature for everyone else, that everyone else automatically did it. Kant says, some actions are so constituted that their maxim cannot even be conceived as a universal law of nature without contradiction. So in other words, there are some maxims that when you try to turn them into a universal law, they get canceled out by the universal law. They become impossible. In the illustrations that Kant gives us, the first 2 are examples of maxims that fail this test, that fail the consistency in conception. So he gives us an example of someone considering suicide from what he calls self-love, what we might just call self-interest. And he gives us someone considering making a lying promise, that is, making a promise that he doesn't intend upon keeping. Those maxims fail the first test, and so they're immoral. We cannot adopt them because they cannot be acted upon at the same time that there is a natural law based upon them. So if there were a natural law that said when things look bleak, everyone will commit suicide. If there were such a natural law, I would not be able to adopt the maxim that I will commit suicide in order to avoid hardship when things look bleak, and so on. But read those carefully. What's happening here is that the existence of the universal law of nature makes the maxim impossible. We cannot even conceive of living by the maxim where the universal law of nature is in place. And so, because of that, Kant says we have a rigorous duty to refrain from adopting those maxims. The suicide from self-love illustration is notoriously difficult. The lying promise example is a little more straightforward. I think you'll understand it quite a bit easier. The idea is that if it were a universal law, that when it served their interests, everyone would make a promise that he or she did not intend to keep. If that were a natural law like gravity, then it wouldn't make sense for me to try to tell a lying promise, because it wouldn't work. It doesn't even make sense. I'd be laughed at. And so Kant says, because the maxim fails the first test, the consistency and conception test, we have a rigorous duty to refrain from adopting that maxim. But if a maxim passes the first test, if I can conceive of me acting on the maxim while everyone else is living by the law, then we move on to the second test. And the second test is one of consistency and willing. Now, if we were not interested in illuming the different kinds of duties, then we would only need the second test. As Kant says on page 91, this is the general canon, the general rule for all moral judgment of action. So the general rule is I must be able to will that my maxims serve as a universal law. But of course I can't will something that's inconceivable, and so it would fail the first test. Any maxim that failed the first test would also fail the second. In order for a maxim to be able to simultaneously serve as a universal law of nature, we must be able to consistently will that it do so. Kant says we must be able to will that a maxim of our action should become a universal law. So every time we choose, every time we make a choice and we adopt a maxim, Kant says that we're also willing that everyone else should live by the maxim as if it were a universal law of nature like gravity. That's what the good will does. The good will adopts a maxim and says, I will do this, and then sort of looks around and says, and everyone else should do this too, because this is what's right, this is what's good. So again, the problem is that there are other things that we're willing at the same time that we're trying to will that this maxim serve as a universal law. What we end up with is this inconsistency, that we're trying to will a certain maxim become a universal law, but that's inconsistent with other things that we're willing, and so it fails the second test. So these two illustrations that he gives us, 3 and 4, the neglect of talents and the rejection of charity, those are examples of maxims that I can conceive of a world where I live by the maxim while everyone else lives by the universal law, but I can't consistently will it. And so what I end up with is a meritorious duty to cultivate my own talents and to help others where I can. So because it fails the second test, we have a different kind of duty. Okay, so I'm not going to say a whole lot more now, but hopefully this will help you understand illustrations 1 through 4, where you realize that Kant does have a method that he is applying as he works through those examples.